Oh, yeah. No, it's always on vibration mood.
That's perfect.
Me. For 10 years now on vibration.
Are you recording this? Yeah, because we wanted this as the intro. 10 years she's been on vibration mode.
Listen. There was before we became independent, before South Sudan became independent, now President Salva Kiir, then whatever, came to Iowa. And I was a part of the civil society then. And then, so he comes to this, and then the Secretary General for the SPLM, he goes, everybody, put your phone on vibration mode or silent. And if it's not, you will be dealt with. I was like, you will be dealt with. So every time I'm like, in some spaces that they get the joke, I'll be like, put your phone on vibration mode or you will be dealt with.
Oh my goodness.
CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy. This is Series 1 of Conversations with Women in African Philanthropy, a CAPSI program known as Adɔyɛ. The series was recorded at the sidelines of a retreat that took place at the Wits Rural Facility in Limpopo in January 2025, hosted by CAPSI's Adɔyɛ program and Nawi AfriFem Collective. Adɔyɛ is dedicated to celebrating and amplifying the contributions of African women in philanthropy while creating spaces for dialogue, learning, and collaboration. Adɔyɛ operates under the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment, aligning its mission with broader goals of promoting effective philanthropic practices in Africa. Through its efforts, Adɔyɛ seeks to build knowledge, foster dialogue, cultivate partnerships, and advocate for policies that support women in philanthropy.
So it's been on vibration mode.
So before we get into the serious matters,
so the interface between philanthropy and South Sudan, a couple of years back, I'm trying to think what year it was, the Humanity United Foundation once approached a couple of us, they were first approached by the government in South Sudan after they had established a philanthropy center in Liberia.
Yeah.
And the government in South Sudan wanted to do the same. And so they approached Humanity United and they took us to the Bellagio Center in Italy.
Listen, everybody's going to Bellagio but me. Can I go to Bellagio?
Yeah. So we went there actually to discuss philanthropy in South Sudan and how they were planning to help the government of South Sudan in its early stages to actually set up different resource initiatives. As you were speaking of that, I was just having these faces of these generals, and they didn't say put your phones on vibration mode then, but But are you aware of that initiative at all?
So no, I'm not aware of it.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of disconnect between those of us in the diaspora and those that are at home, and those that are also in the African diaspora, right? And so I was heavily involved in America in that space, and it's unfortunate sometimes that we kind of get overlooked as if we did not help in the liberation, but we were actually the ones that advocated for those of us in the diaspora to vote for now self-determination and all of these things. So, but initiatives like that, unless you're in the space, but from my own experience, it may not be other people's experience. I feel that those of us that are diaspora and trying to come back home, we get sidelined and there's gatekeeping to spaces. So I wasn't aware of it because, I mean, clearly my background is in conflict resolution and I know the work that's being done in Bellagio, that is just a space to, like what we're doing here, to just decompress from the world and actually think about serious matter and serious issue and be creative in the solutions to come out of it.
Anyway, welcome to our third conversation on African philanthropy with me, Beginkosi Moyo. I'm excited today to be joined by a sister. She calls me a cousin, Nyamal Tutdeal, who is a former refugee from South Sudan, but now settled in the United States. Also an adjunct professor, as well as an executive director and co-founder of the Nya Eden Foundation.
Nya Eden,
Nya Eden Foundation. Nyamal, welcome.
Thank you for having me, cousin.
So the young one said, those who know.
You know, you're my southern cousin.
So let's start with what I think is a fascinating story and journey, and this is not just unique to you, but many others in the continent. Maybe, in your own words, I know you have told this a number of times, and this morning at breakfast, I just kind of overheard you talking about your life as a young person, as a refugee, moving between different countries, born in Ethiopia, raised in Sudan, ending up in the United States. Maybe just briefly, who is Nyamal?
Hey, that one is difficult. Because Nyamal has evolved, right? Nyamal has evolved, and of course my lived experience has something to do with it. And it's interesting because I have, there's a project that I'm on, a healing project with the ARMA Institute. And one of the questions we ask is, who are you and whose are you, right? To get us away from the, oh, my name is Nyamal and I do this and I do this and I do this. And it's like, that's not who you are, right? So I also had to learn to now say, but who am I in my totality? So I would introduce myself as, Nyamal. Nyamal means girl of peace. So whether the ancestors, God, the universe, or my family had in mind, whether they chose the name for me or the name chose me, I'm not quite sure. But Nyamal is truly living in her name, right? So I am a person that, lives in conflict, but also self-conflict. I am a daughter of a woman, a resilience woman, a man that is also a practitioner, a healer, and I come from a people that are indigenous to not only Ethiopia, but South Sudan. And so I tend to not own spaces. I'm an African woman. Nyamal is an African woman, and wherever I find my space. So now Nyamal is a Ghanaian, right? Trying to learn Ghana and all of that stuff. But ultimately, I'm a friend, I'm a sister, I'm an educator, I'm a healer. That's who I am.
And for those that are still to encounter your experiences and your journey, maybe a brief summary of what I think is a fascinating but powerful story of where you were born and where you are today. Maybe a bit of that journey.
Okay, I can definitely do that. All right, so basically, I laugh when I do lectures or when I am spaces like this and said, what, I think I was conceived in conflict, right? I clearly was born in conflict. So I'm a prodigy. I'm a prodigy or project of war in South Sudan and in Ethiopia, right? So my earlier fundamental year were shaped by war, were shaped by displacement. I was born in Ethiopia. The Nuer people, or as we refer to ourselves as Nath, the original people, are cut by the border. So my family literally was cut in half by the border. So I was born on the Ethiopia side of my people, and then my ancestral bloodline is in the South Sudan side. So we kind of migrate between both of the borders. I was born in the 80s because my parents fled the first civil war, the first Sudan civil war, and then the second civil war, obviously. So we kind of were going back and forth. Born in the 80s, survived 2 wars as a child in the 90s. And then we were resettled in the US, where I grew up in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, in the Midwest. And I often say that I also survived a 3rd war, which is the racial war. And I joke and said, well, I've survived whiteness in its totality. That's just an express journey of self, border identity, surviving war, and then being resettled as a refugee, having to now learn about Blackness, right? I think most of us that are immigrants or even expatriates that go to the US often we say we didn't know we were black until we went into the US, right?
Yeah.
And then for me, I did not know the degree of my blackness, right? As well sun-kissed as I am, I think the sun loved me so much that I was just like, mwah, I'm gonna kiss you extra.
Yeah.
So the sun kissed me a little bit extra, and you know that was a little bit difficult for some of our other cousins. To be like, hey, this one, she's a little, you know, she's extra black. Where is she from? So that's just a little bit of my journey of, you know.
Yeah. And then early morning, and I said to you, we should talk afterwards. You were talking about how you want to retrace the story of your father. And, you know, immediately after that, I was talking, I don't remember this, Christelle, I was saying, I want to talk to Nyamal because a couple of years back, I did a case study of, there's a program officer at the Ford Foundation office in Kenya, whose father was a philanthropist for the entire village.
Wow.
In, you know, entire village, including, you know, people who were strangers. Basically, he turned his house into a philanthropy to the extent that his wife ended up suffering from what you call this, like depression, as a result of his philanthropy. We've documented that, and so as you were speaking in the morning, I just felt like maybe this is another story that we could work with you to actually trace back, because I saw philanthropy in it, but I think for you wanted to trace, you know, his work, but also identity and all of that. Maybe let's talk a bit about your father, if it is a comfortable space to go
Oh,
into.
it is. It's very much so. And it's interesting, right? When you told me let's talk, I was like, this man just found his funding from the graves. Right? Because it's something that I've wanted to do for so long.
Yeah.
And just you talking now and saying the word philanthropy, I'm like, I've been living with a woman and a man. So both my parents, my mother, they were philanthropists. And you just named it for me right now because I never had my room to myself. There was always an auntie in my room. There was always a cousin. There was always, even when we were in the US and when we were in the camps, so my formative years were in a refugee camp. So my father was a judge in Gambela, Ethiopia. And then we were transferred to Yitang. That's where one of the land that the refugees, the Sudanese refugees were at. So he did conflict resolution there. And I remember our house was always full of people. And then when we went back home, of course, he was a judge. Our house was always full of people. And then when we come to the US with my mother, our house was always full of people. I'm just like, so until you name it, I was like, hey. My parents have always been philanthropists and the space and how they shared. In Nasser, where I'm from, where my ancestral, I remember one of the faded memories I have is that our house was at the edge of town and people would always stop to drink water before they travel and walk to make their way to Khartoum. So crazy, huh?
Yeah. So, I mean, talking about philanthropy, I also see that a lot of the work that you do yourself can be classified as philanthropy. So let's talk a bit about some of the activism that you're involved in, especially around immigrants, some of the rights, as well as, you know, you ending up at the White House during Obama's time. What are we doing at the White House?
Hey, I was there as a fabulous. I was there as a fine girl with no pimples. No.
Yeah. On a serious note,
On a serious note, I was there because I took up advocacy as a refugee, right? As a former refugee. I saw that there was a lot of spaces that people were telling our story on our behalf, but we were not invited into the spaces. So I inserted myself in the spaces and said, nope, that's not who we are, that's not what we want, right? And when also for me, it's something that I found myself doing in a lot of the South Sudanese male-dominated spaces, especially in the US as well, where it's like, oh, you know, we think women like orange, so we're gonna give them orange. I'm like, no, actually we like yellow.
Yeah.
I'm here to say we like yellow. So I was advocating with Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services. That was the organization that resettled my family. So I lent my voice to them. They had a refugee and a migrant leadership academy that 2013 I was a participant, and then I went back as a facilitator. As somebody that developed workshops and programming for them. That's what took me to the White House, because that year the U.S. was able to bring in 95,000 refugees, but we felt the urge that there should be 10,000 added, just particularly for Syrians. That's when the Syrian war was going on, and the crisis was needed in Syria. So we went to the White House to say, hey, we can bring in 95, but actually we can bring in 10,000 more, because there were certain states that were lacking. Their population was getting older, right? And with refugee population, most of them being women, young, those states can handle them. So that's how I ended up in the White House, of just advocating for that particular year of Syrian refugees to be added to the resettlement cases. And as a former child, as a former refugee, being able to say, this is what happens when we give vulnerable population, vulnerable people, the opportunity to fully be able to be in a space where they can give back, right? If the refugee process in the U.S. didn't give my family the opportunity, you and I would not be sitting here. I don't know where the trajectory of my life would have gone. Right. So that's how I ended up in the White House. And then also I ended up in the White House on Capitol Hill, moderating breakfasts as well, and humanizing our story. But then with the racism and the xenophobia towards immigrants and refugees, I've gone back to those spaces. Often when I'm there, I don't tell people that I'm a former refugee. I just share, my first job was a paper route. And that is as American as can get. Paper route and molding lawn in high school. So they're like, oh, wow, your first job is a paper route. I'm like, I'm also a refugee. So,
So, like you said, people want to know more about you, can actually Google you, because your story is there. So I want us to perhaps focus on things that are not on easily available. This morning when I attended an impromptu session there, I saw something that really moved me. It sounded as if you have some healing powers, if I can put it that way. Let's talk about those bells and and grounding people. How does that come about, and how have you utilized it in your work? I saw it in action, and I just thought that's something that very few people have the privilege of experiencing.
So it's interesting, right? Because a lot of people don't know this side of me. I don't bring it out. Maybe because the spaces I've been the only person that looked like me. And I didn't have the capability, or I didn't have the permission to bring that healing side of me out. Even when I teach, I do grounding differently with my students. But in this space, when I came in, I said, something is missing, right? So I went to the sisters and I was like, this is what I'm able to offer. Everybody was like, yes. Maseko was like, yes. Joy was like, yes. And Zuki was like, yes. And so I was like, okay, I'll bring my healing side to it. My father was a healer. And I think without knowing, I've inherited. And now that I'm in the African continent, it has sparked, right? Because the ancestral knowledge that's coming through me is something that I wasn't aware of, because I was in a concrete jungle. Even though I'm in a concrete jungle, Accra right now, but there's still that familiar energy, familiar smells and the trees, and just being around Blackness and Africanness. So for me, a lot of the sisters were like, wait, you do this? I'm like,
So actually, you've been joking about being my cousin.
Yes.
So I remember vividly growing up, my mother used to wake me up early in the morning. And every time she would dream of somebody visiting her, she would already know which tree to go to. And so she would wake me up maybe around 3 a.m., 4 a.m. and say, accompany me there's somebody who will come during the day in need of help. And then we'll go into the bush, wherever she would, something will guide her into that tree. She will do whatever she needs to do, bring it home. And that very day, somebody would come to actually get assistance. So as you were doing that thing, my head was spinning. I was going back to my young age. And so indeed, we might be cousins.
Listen, you may never know, right?
Yeah.
And I think sometimes when it comes to relations, we limit, ourselves to the blood relations.
Yeah.
We often don't think about the spiritual connection, right? The fact that you just share your mother's story, maybe it was you needing to come to this space to remember that, right? And say, okay, all right. And I don't know if your mother is here.
No, she's not here anymore. But yeah, it's quite crazy because the last days have been intense, and me experiencing that thing in the morning was such I mind something. But I think what I really want to get out of it is, what do you think we are missing, given that we are so abundantly endowed with such gifts in Africa, but we rarely see it in practice? I mean, here and there you can see, people doing, maybe even abusing it, and yet we know that there's power in some of these gifts, and yet we still remain so behind, underdeveloped. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts are, it's the stigma. It's the stigma, right? Of course, the famous quote is, when they came, they gave us they asked us to bow our head, and when we open our head, they gave us the Bible and they had our land.
Yeah.
It's the stigma that Christianity have brought, right? And I grew up a Christian, so I can be critical of self. I felt like the prosperity gospel that has been brought to us, because many of our indigenous people knew God before they brought us the Bible. And I ended up finding this out because of my late grandmother's, my mother's mother, and I'm inviting her into space by saying her name. She was never baptized, but she knew God.
Yeah.
But she also communed with the ancestors in a way that, like you said, 4 o'clock, 3 o'clock, that's what my grandmother would have full-blown conversation with the ancestors, or she'll have conversation with God. Coming back to the continent is the stigma of me pouring libation, regardless if I'm in a fancy event with nice wine, I find a way of like, and then continuing, right? And that's just honoring, right?
Yeah.
But again, other people be like, hey, she's doing juju. She's
Yeah.
doing juju, right? And so our own practices have been weaponized.
Right.
Because if we fully invoke them, the story would be different for us as a people. So it has to be weaponized so that we do not fully live our full potential. So I think for me, it's also when we're talking about philanthropy and funding, I don't do this because funders always ask, well, is it certified?
Yeah.
Did a white man say you can practice it? Right? And I was talking to one of the sisters earlier, and I was like, she's like, why don't you do this? Because I was like, well, I learned this knowledge from my grandmothers.
Yeah.
Nobody certified me in the Western context, in the formal education. This is informal education that I learned from watching and asking questions of my elders and so forth. I remember when I was in the US, we do, I guess I call myself a postpartum nurse, and we do this water therapy. We call it mor. When a woman's give birth, she goes through like a hot water oil therapy. It's basically massage therapy, but there is other stuff to it. And then with the baby, I remember my cousin gave birth, and we called an auntie, a grandmother. She was not able to make it. And so I was like, oh, I can do it. She's like, what do you mean? So we had conversation. I walked her through what I've learned. And so when I did it, she called and was like, where's the baby? My cousin was like, oh, the baby fell asleep right away. She's like, okay, you've done it.
Yeah.
So then I automatically became a mother in my community. I became a grandmother because I was able to perform this ritual.
Yeah.
And when I was in the US, I remember a young girl was like, she's like, ooh, so you're technically a doula. I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm a healer. She's like, can you teach me? How much would you charge? I'm like, no, this is a closed practice.
Yeah.
It's a closed practice. I'm not charging. I'm not monetizing it. So for me, I feel like that's what's missing, right? Because some of us want to practice this, but life happens.
Yeah.
And also we live in a world that you also need to, make a living, because we don't know how to monetize our gifts, and we shouldn't monetize them.
Yeah.
And if we do, there is a level of integrity that's not there.
Yeah.
So in the philanthropy space, what's also missing is that when we have people like myself or other people doing alternative, as they call it, alternative practices, is to be able to say, okay, here's your funding, do what you got to do, right? Instead of saying, well, I healed 3 people, I use this methodology. But the stigma, ultimately, of our own practices is what's...
Yeah, yet in the field that you are in, conflict resolution, refugee, migration, forced migration for that matter, there's actually a need for healing. And so one would immediately think that your gift ought to be the one that is actually leading, because that's what is needed in that space. And yet when it comes to funding and recognition, that's not given the priority that it's supposed to have. But I'm also interested to know a bit about what your foundation is working on. So maybe let's start by talking about why it was set up, what is its mandate, and what are the core program features and areas that you are working on.
So the Nya Eden Foundation was birthed between my co-founder, who happens to also a cousin, family cousin. When South Sudan went into war in 2013, she and I felt very helpless because we've experienced forced migration. We've experienced having to have your grandmother or your auntie just grab you as a child and move, right? It's a matter of life and death. So we felt very helpless, and we actually started with a very privileged mindset. We're like, oh, let's do a broad drive. We had to look at ourselves and like, a broad drive. Is that what really women want? Is that what really women need that are fleeing for their life is bras? So we had to check our privilege thinking. And so we're like, okay, what did we need in migration? And so we're like, okay. So that's how the Nya Eden Foundation became about. We're like, we needed a safe space for us, right? And then also, what products did we do? So our first program was around menstrual health. We're like, okay, thank God, as young women, we got our period in the US. We didn't have to worry about period poverty, even though in the US there is period poverty. And so we just started, okay, we can start with that. And then my background is in conflict resolution, and Kuth, her background is in sociology. So we kind of just went from there. Healing is a part of our component as well, community healing and indigenous knowledge healing. And then, of course, conflict resolution. And that's kind of where we started. So we were doing a lot of behind-the-scene advocacy work because we were both living our lives as well. And so that's where a lot of the refugee advocacy work came from. And in 2019, before COVID happened, I had the opportunity to go to Gambela, where I was born and where she was also born. We were donated menstrual hygiene kits from Days for Girls, and Ethiopian Airlines sponsored us with tickets. We're like, because we did the whole for your social responsibility. And they were so happy to be like, oh wow, you're going back to the very place. And my team was very conscious of, although we were from this community and we spoke one of the languages, to come back with cultural humility, because community does evolve. And I feel that even in the NGO and the philanthropy space, we Black people actually perpetrate white savior complex worse than the white people do. And so my team was very conscious of that. We met with the Human Rights Commissioner at the time. He gave us a layout, and we later find out that the women that are incarcerated, that are in the prison system, they have it even worse of having access to menstrual products. And so we went to Gambela. We went to a refugee camp. We did not only distribute the menstrual hygiene product, but our nurse, Mana, was able to educate them about the reproductive health system, that your period does not start when you're bleeding. It's a whole in our native languages. Yeah. We talked, we did early childhood marriage conversations with our elders, and of course HIV courses, and a little bit of peace building with a young woman in a boarding school, because in Gambela there's 5 ethnic groups, and the Nuer and the Anyuaks have had historical conflicts, and that often really just spills out into the greater community. So we've challenged the young girls to be interrupters of conflict. Yeah. Because at the end of the day, women, we're the one losing our husbands, our sons, ourselves, homes, and all of that stuff. Because when men fight, or the African proverbs, when 2 elephants fight, it's the grass that gets hurt. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we were encouraging these young women, you're the grass in this case. So how can you make sure that you can be an interrupter of conflict? So that's what the Nya Eden Foundation does. We do peace building work, we do scholarship programming, early childhood marriages, and then menstrual conversations. Yeah.
So most NGOs or foundations like yours would obviously have opportunities that they take on, and you have described some of them, but they would also face some barriers and challenges. So maybe we talk a bit about some of those barriers and challenges. What are those that you have encountered?
Of course, funding. Yeah. Funding is a big thing. Yeah. Because it's a Black African-led organization. Yeah. Some of I remember when we were setting up, they were like, oh, you need to have some white people in the space to be able to get funding or trusted. Yeah. Also, one of the biggest things that I've realized, even when we went to the field, is that a lot of the bigger organizations don't want to partner with small organizations like ourselves. I remember we reached out to UNICEF, all of these things. We're like, hey, we're recipients and we're coming back home. Yeah. But the head office are like, well, there's duplication in programming and da-da-da-da. We're like, okay, whatever, we're gonna do it. But when we got to the ground, they were like, wait, who in the head office did you guys talk to? Because you're the very people that the community would listen to. Yeah. Right? Because when we went back, it was like, so how old are you? You're not married? And so again, having that conversation of when you actually allow a girl to be educated, this is how she can give back to the community. And we're not saying don't get married, right? Yeah. We're saying that, grab the small opportunities that you have, because again, I love Proverbs. In Nuer, we say, "Tetkel pat," which translates to one hand cannot clap itself. Yeah. Right. So it's like if you take on the little bit of education, give you opportunity to have a job. When you get married, the responsibility won't just be on your husband, right? You'll be able to also contribute financially or whatever it is. So, but barrier is definitely funding, partnerships with bigger organizations, and just the bureaucracy sometimes of what we're doing and so forth. But definitely the 2 big things is funding and partnerships. Yeah. And I mean, we are here in Limpopo, at the rural facility, and part of this idea was to bring women from different experiences to just reflect and use the opportunity to write. Yeah. Maybe we can talk a bit about, if you are open to discussing, what is it that you are working on, and what has the experience been like so far? So can I just say I'm grateful. Yeah. Grateful, because this opportunity doesn't come in, particularly at the beginning of a year, where you can actually reflect and set your intentions for the rest of the year. Never thought myself of a writer, although I'm an oral traditional storyteller. Because I've never had the space and time to just sit still. And this space has allowed that to happen. And so the gratitude is there for me. And so in my culture, when we say thank you, we really don't say thank you doesn't mean anything to me. In Nuer, we say chiloidatet for this space. And chiloidatet literally translate to my heart has fallen.
So what happens when the heart falls? So
That's how much gratitude. That's how much gratitude. So for me, when I got invited, I was like, okay. And our Liberian sister Cortez invited me. I was like, we met in South Sudan at a conference, and I was like, but I'm not a writer. She's like, madame, you are a writer, right? So I have bits and pieces of things. So I submitted my memoir. I started working on my memoir. I submitted 2 pages. But then when I came into this space, and something that what I'm working on is actually entitled 1159.
Yeah.
I like your color.
Wow.
So I'm working on.
Wait, 1159. I like your color. Maybe before we get there, that sounds like you have kind of connected with your creative side.
I think so.
And maybe we can use this opportunity to credit you for designing this in the morning, which is going to be a signature for this series.
Okay.
So this is going to be the signature for the series, and also, the way we are sitting. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
And so this creative side, are you a designer? Are you an artist? What are you?
So what had happened was, so actually my creative side, I would say that I used to model.
Okay.
I guess I design clothes. I'm in the fashion space as well.
Yeah.
It's just something that comes natural to me. Like I would just look at a space and I'd be like, oh, it's missing something. This is what it needs. It just comes natural to me. So yeah, because I think it might be because I lived in the U.S. and as a Black woman, you always have to show up in perfection.
Yeah.
So
back to 1159. I like your color.
So 1159, I like your color. It's actually, for me, like when I was saying earlier, many of us immigrants that go to the U.S. don't know we were Black until we get to the U.S. And for me, it's like I do know the degree of my Blackness as well. So learning about colorism.
Okay.
So I'm writing about colorism and the effects of colorism to myself and to many other dark-skinned women in the U.S. or in the global North, but particularly in the global South. So for me, when on my phone, on my notes, I keep comments that I hear people say about my complexion. And in my notes, it's entitled A Melanin Tale. Mm-hmm. So every time I hear somebody say something, I'll write it down if it's out of the norm. And I remember in high school, the first time I was made aware of how dark I am from an African American, where I'm like, okay, this is my cousin, this is my brother. But they were like, no, you're other. And I'm like, why is this happening? So of course, luckily I was a curious adolescent, a curious young adult. Started learning about the transatlantic slave trade and what happened to our people, because now I'm getting a new identity as an African American, but I don't know the legacy of slavery and what happened to the people there. Now the other layer of enslavement is those that were born of the masters, the light-skinned ones worked in the house, and those of us that were dark-skinned worked the fields and the cotton fields. So being called a field Negro, and I'm like, what is that? I didn't have a relationship to it, but again, this was an identity that was forced on me. So one of the sisters and the brothers, they were called 1159. Okay. But I was midnight because I was darker than them. So that's where the title came in.
Yeah, I was still waiting to get to the 1159. You remind me of what's his name, Michael Blackson, who actually talks about how most people make jokes about him, and because he's dark, so they call him midnight or under the table or things like that. So now it makes sense.
So I was midnight. My friend was 1159. And then in Ghana, I've realized that in the U.S., I've experienced colorism from a white supremacy lens. Coming back to the continent and living in Ghana, I've experienced colorism from a colonial lens. I'm like, I can't catch a break. So regardless of where I'm at, I could go hang out at a chop bar or I could be at the most fanciest place. There will always somebody that's gonna come be like, ooh, I like your color.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm like, right? The whole like, I like your color, you know. And I guess you'll have to read the piece when it comes out to get some of the other clever.
But what are some of the themes that that you are touching without getting into detail? Because we also want people to to buy or to subscribe, whatever the issue will be at that point once the work is out. But what are some of the themes that or sub themes that you are touching
definitely
on?
identity.
Yeah.
Right, and there's a bit of intergenerational.
Yeah.
Beauty standards. Beauty standards definitely a big thing.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And as much as I'm writing from my experience being a dark-skinned woman, I've also had conversation with my sisters that are on the other spectrum of blackness, right? Because there's an array of shades of blackness, right? We are as light as an albino sister and as dark as me. And we all experience it differently, right? And then those that come from biracial families, right? So for me, I've realized in some of the conversations I've had with my light-skinned sister, they also get fetishized from the other perspective. So definitely beauty standard, identity, intergenerational conversations around beauty and what does that look like, belonging, and where does one belong, right? Yeah. So those are some of the themes.
So how has it been so far, here in the company of resource people, but also others with different experiences completely from yours, but also meeting some people for the first time.
I know, right?
So on the one hand, you are trying to write, but you are also having to deal with all these emotions, but also with all these different encounters. So, as we think about the next iteration of the program, what are some of the things that you would pick out and say, this is what I think is working, but there's these things that I also think that for the next group, this is what we should be focusing on.
Yeah, I mean, for me, there's earlier, like we were putting our community agreement together, our social contract, our social agreement, not contract, sisterhood. There's a level of sisterhood here that I haven't felt in different spaces, but I think also for me, the land lent to it. The walks that we do in the morning, whether it's a group walk or individual walks, the conversation, the in-depth conversations that we're having, the level of sisterhood here for me it's something that I haven't experienced. Because some of us are coming in with like, oh my gosh, I'm afraid, or why am I in this space? But then we realize that you do belong, right? You belong in this space. I think for me, definitely also there's a sense of openness. When I came in, I was just like, oh, there's a healing component that's missing because I'm an empath and I can feel the energy of my sisters and what was happening. And so I was like, we were talking about trauma, right? And so it triggered not only myself and I think a few of the other sisters. So the next day, I'm like, can we do a circle processing where we did? And there's certain people in the space that opened up that I was like, I was supposed to be here for that to happen. We cried individually and we cry collectively and release because we have to be so perfect and in our mask in the other spaces that we are in that this space just allowed. So for me, I would say that as much as we're writing, we're also needing to heal as well. Because we're healing some things, we're writing about some things that are not only triggering to us, but also societal triggers. So how do we merge healing and writing at the same time? So for me, but we naturally, it was missing and we naturally just brought it in. We naturally just brought it in and we offered our self-gift. And the facilitators are amazing. Because for me, I came in and I was like, I'm not a writer, right? But it's like, no, I am a writer. I was allowed to own that I am a writer. Because our perception of writing is coming from a European lens, that you have to do this and this and that. But I'm Shakespeare.
Shakespeare,
No, I'm Shakespeare. I'm shaking spears, okay?
So you are Shakespeare, not
Yes.
Shakespeare. Okay.
I'm
All right.
Shakespeare. Yes.
So as we end, other than documenting your father's story
Yes.
for this year, what are the other plans that you have set your eyes on and you would want to at least either start or to achieve in 2025?
Well, definitely holding healing spaces for us,
Yeah.
African women. I'm very passionate about restorative justice and our indigenous knowledge. So I teach restorative justice.
Yeah.
I'm teaching from indigenous knowledge that was written by white men in our field. And so for me, one of the things that I'm asking the ancestors, the universe, and God to do is to bring that funding so that I can document indigenous knowledge, restorative justice processes. Because I remember my grandmother, Young Muda, before she transitioned and before I took her back home in the US, I was like, tell me our family tree. So as she was going through our family tree, she said, but there's this family that you can't get married to because there's been a broken bone and that bone hasn't been mended. I said, what do you mean? And then, of course, we had the conversation of what that means. And for me, I'm like, that's restorative justice, right? And so, and I'm very saddened that the conflict that's happening in South Sudan, some of them are not new, but we've always had our indigenous way of restoring, but we've left that. Because again, ego has gone into people and all of these things, but I don't want those lost arts of restorative justice, of healing, right? Because restorative justice, part of it is healing. We're restoring something that has been broken. So for me, I know that there are other stuff that's documented, but I feel like for us as a people, the African continent, we have not. You know, for South Sudan, they were like, oh, the reconciliation, South Africa reconciliation. I'm like, that doesn't work for us because our perpetrators become victim and the victim. And I'm like, and it hasn't worked for South Africa either. So let's just own it. It hasn't worked for South Africa. And then, many people talk about Rwanda and the Gacaca courts. And it's like, okay, there's issues there too and whatnot. So like, how do we go to our elders before those living libraries perish? And so that's one of the things that is in the universe this year as well. So,
And of course, many people might be wondering, what is all of this got to do with philanthropy? And of course, for me, sitting here and listening to you, I already see several papers that I can write on. So one of them is around philanthropy and healing. So healing is a public, it's a private resource that is used for public good. And the definition of philanthropy is voluntary action for public good, or utilization of private resources for public good. So there's one strand there that, if given an opportunity, I would want our students and potentially working with you to develop, which is healing and philanthropy. And I'm not so sure that there have been any papers that have been done on that. So I would want us at some point to talk about, some scholarship around that. And then the second is, peace, conflict resolution, and philanthropy. Again, philanthropy is positioned, but is also operated as a public good for social justice. And so we cannot even start to think about conflict resolution, peace building, without the different notions of philanthropy. On the one hand is mutuality, reciprocity, solidarity, etc. And these features, if not present in peace building and conflict resolution, then forget it. So I would also want at some point, to dig into the Shakespeare and we develop that.
I'm glad you didn't say pick the brain.
No. To dig into the
To
Shaka
dig,
sphere.
yes.
Yeah. So I would want us to think about that as our next project together. I'm really excited to have met you.
Likewise.
And honestly speaking, I didn't even know that the reason why you ended up here is because of Koto.
Yeah.
So Koto and I met more than 20 years ago.
Wow.
When I used to do some work in Liberia. And she was the sister who welcomed me in Liberia and helped me set up Trust Africa in Liberia. And so when she reconnected now, working in South Sudan for the UN, it was easy for us to actually say we are doing this. And so if the connection is through Koto again, for me, I see some divine intervention there. So Nyamal, thank you so much for making the time. I know that we have really not gone deeper into who you are and the work that you have done. And what we're going to do is to try and lead our audience into some of the articles, some of the videos that are online, which I've seen around your work. So we'll lead our audiences to that. But in our next conversation, hopefully we'll be talking about the product that has come out of here or the work that you are doing. Like I said, I'm also keen to find ways that we can work together to do the documentary that you wanted to actually do. So thank you so much for making the time.
Yeah, Chiloida.
Yeah. Your heart has fallen.
Yes, Chiloida for having me into this space. And I don't believe there isn't a coincident meeting. There's no chance meeting. Everything is orchestrated. It's either for a lesson, a reason, or a blessing. Those are the three ways I look at it. And so I think there's definitely been a blessing in this space. And for you as a cousin, as a brother, to also be able to say, you know what, I have a couple of sisters that need a space to just be still and write, whether it's their story or stories of other women, because African women, you know, or I could say Black women as, why am I forgetting his name? Oh, Malcolm X says the most disrespected woman is a Black woman, right? It's not just for Africa, it's not just for the US, but I think globally. You know, I would collectively, the energy of my sister that I felt to say, also say thank you for being a brother behind us and saying, you know what, hey, these crazy ones that are running around, they need to sit and just be still and heal and do the work that they need to do. So thank you. Thank you.
So once again, thank you so much. That was Nyamal joining us here on the sidelines of the Women Writing Retreat here in Mpumalanga at the Veteran Facility. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.
All right. Bye.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.